In this video, we are going to talk about the role of inflammation in the immune response. Inflammation is considered to be part of the second line of defense in the immune system, and it is an innate immune response. Particularly, we will talk about how white blood cells communicate with each other during an infection. We'll talk about the goals of inflammation and the steps of inflammation. We'll talk about a couple of the drawbacks of inflammation, and then we'll finish our discussion by talking about what happens after inflammation. Previously, we've talked about how the skin is a barrier to protect against infection. Particularly, we talked about how keratinocytes, which are cells that produce high amounts of the protein keratin, provide a fairly impenetrable barrier to infection. However, if this barrier is breached, creating an entry through a parenteral route, then what we'll find are resident cells, part of both the innate and adaptive immune response, that are ready to prevent infection from spreading. In inflammation, we're specifically going to talk about the role of dendritic cells and macrophages, which are both types of monocytes, and we'll also talk about the role of neutrophils. Now, the immune system communicates through a chemical language, and this chemical language includes the use of molecules that we call cytokines. Cytokines are molecules that will bind receptors on the surface of target cells, and this binding is going to activate or repress a response. So in this example here, what we're showing is a white blood cell. It's received some sort of activating signal. This often can be the binding of a pathogen to that cell. And in response, this cell is going to produce potentially different types of cytokines that will allow it to communicate with other cells that an infection is occurring. Now, not all cells are going to produce the same cytokines. They're also not all going to respond to the same cytokines. However, cytokines may activate multiple types of cells at one time, and the language can be quite complex. Sometimes it's the combination of 2 or 3 different cytokines that will trigger specific responses within cells. In this image, then, what I am showing you are different examples of cytokines. Some cytokines are known as the interleukins, like interleukin 1. These are ones that are found to increase inflammation. For example, IL-1 activates macrophages. And there are other interleukins that also stimulate the immune response, both the adaptive and the innate immune response. Then there are chemokines. Chemokines are chemical attractants. Cells that are exposed to these chemokines and that respond to them will perform chemotaxis, in which they will move in the direction of increasing concentrations of these chemokines, and this often will lead them toward the site of an infection. Interferons, which are named because they interfere with infections, are produced by all cells. These function as an antiviral response. Oftentimes, responses include shutting down the transcription and translation so as to slow down viral replication and biosynthesis. And then also cells will respond to anti-inflammatory cytokines or anti-inflammatory interleukins like IL-10. And so here we see kind of 4 major areas in which cytokines work: to either increase or decrease an immune response, to function as chemoattractants, or to function to essentially control the activity of both cells that are involved in the immune system and cells that are not part of the immune system. Now, inflammation is, as we've already mentioned, a second line of defense, and the goal of inflammation is to control an infection at the site where the infection has begun or at the site of entry. And this is going to involve the innate immune response. There are 3 main goals to inflammation. First, destroy the agent, either living or non-living, that has caused the injury. Secondly, the goal is to limit the effect of the pathogen or foreign object by confining it with clotting factors. And then third, repair and replace damaged tissue. For the purposes of our conversation, we are largely going to focus on the first and second goal of this process. So let's now go through the various steps of inflammation. In the picture on the right-hand side here, you're seeing an injury that has been caused in which pathogens have entered underneath the layer of skin here. Again, this is known as the parenteral route of entry. There are going to be resident macrophages and resident dendritic cells located in the tissue here that are going to help to recognize the pathogen. We oftentimes will refer to this first step as injury, in which those resident dendritic cells and macrophages will bind to foreign material and perform phagocytosis. Again, this is some sort of stimulus then that is going to lead to these cells secreting cytokines, which will activate white blood cells such as neutrophils, and also they're going to be secreting chemokines, which are going to begin to recruit neutrophils to the site of infection. And we'll talk about that in a minute. We see a couple of other things also occurring during these early steps. These are known as vasodilation and edema. Vasodilation is a case in which the diameter of blood vessels are going to increase. This is oftentimes caused by bradykinin or other chemicals that are released by mast cells. Also, cytokines can have an effect on this. And then edema is going to occur because we're going to begin to see that the endothelial cells that create the capillaries or those blood vessels are going to have little gaps in between them, and that's going to allow for fluid to leak into the tissue. This also then explains some of the signs of inflammation. Vasodilation increases blood flow, which increases temperature at the site of infection, and edema causes swelling, another characteristic of inflammation. So let's talk about how neutrophils actually get recruited to these sites of infections. As we said, chemokines are chemoattractants that are going to trigger the process of chemotaxis. And neutrophils we think of oftentimes as first responders. So the image on the right here is showing a macrophage that is secreting cytokines and chemokines. And what's going to happen is that neutrophils are going to begin to move towards those chemokines, towards increasing concentrations of them. And that movement is going to start out as a rolling movement, where you can kind of think of the image of a tumbleweed rolling across the desert. Well, neutrophils are going to be grabbing loosely onto the receptors that are found on those cells that line the blood vessel, and that's going to cause them to kind of begin to slow down their movement into this rolling movement towards increasing concentrations of chemokines. At some certain point, the neutrophil is going to begin to change its activity. And the change in its activity is a result of its response to cytokines, as well as the response to those cells, or as well as the response of those cells that line the blood vessels. And so what we're going to see here is a tighter binding occurring between the neutrophil and those cells. And we see that the neutrophil begins to perform a crawling event, and this is called margination. Eventually, the neutrophil will exit the blood vessel and move through the tissue to the sites of infection. It does this by squeezing in between those cells that line the blood vessels, and this movement is known as diapedesis or extravasation. And so this is how neutrophils make it to that site. Now, after they get there, neutrophils are going to be activated by the cytokines that are being secreted by those resident macrophages and dendritic cells, and neutrophils are going to begin to perform phagocytosis. At the same time, neutrophils will secrete additional interleukins or cytokines, as well as additional chemokines to recruit more neutrophils to this site of infection, as well as macrophages to this site of infection. Now, we're going to talk about phagocytosis in greater detail in a later lecture, but for right now, what you basically need to know is that phagocytosis is basically the eating of these pathogens. Phagocytes, which include the neutrophils, and macrophages and dendritic cells are going to engulf pathogens, and then as they engulf them, they are going to break them down and release their debris as waste. Now, in addition, at these sites of inflammation, you can see that the neutrophil is releasing some cytotoxic chemicals. It's going to use this to extracellularly kill pathogens. This may also cause some tissue damage. But another thing that we found that that neutrophils can do is generate what we call nets, or neutrophilic extracellular traps. These nets are formations in which the neutrophil ruptures and then traps the microorganism in a gamish of proteins and DNA and other intracellular components. And so through these actions, neutrophils and macrophages do a very good job of controlling the spread of infection. Now, toward the end of inflammation, what we find is the formation of clots, blood clots, including scabs over the surface of where the cut has occurred. And these create what we call abscesses. These are oftentimes going to resolve on their own. However, there are cases in which microorganisms may be able to reside within these abscesses without being destroyed by the immune system. However, the purpose of this process here is to really begin to repair that damaged tissue. And so we find that platelets that are generated by megakaryocytes, one of the types of white blood cells, are going to begin to secrete clotting factors, which are going to kind of wall off this area and prevent the infection from spreading. We'll also find that growth is going to be stimulated by the production of different growth factors. Now, it's important to note here that some microorganisms can overcome the effects of clotting. For example, there is a bacterium genus, the Streptococci, that can produce enzymes that break down clots that allow them to spread outside of clots. We've actually used this enzyme, which is known as streptokinase, as a way to treat blood clots medically. But when it comes to infection, this can be quite detrimental, allowing for this microorganism to spread beyond the site of where entry and inflammation has occurred. Now, after this process of inflammation, what we will find is that there are going to be some cells, like the macrophages, that will travel through lymph vessels and enter into lymph nodes, where they'll then interact with T cells and B cells to activate the adaptive immune response. And so this is the first point where we begin to see the innate and adaptive immune response interacting with each other. We'll talk about this process in greater detail when we discuss the adaptive immune response. Now, the type of inflammation that we have talked about is known as acute inflammation. However, if the immune response cannot control an infection, we might find what we call chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation can occur if there is continual stimulation of the immune response at certain locations. Pro-inflammatory cytokines such as IL-6 and IL-1 would lead or would be produced during chronic inflammation. And one of the ways that we can treat chronic inflammation would be with anti-inflammatory cytokines, but that does not seem to work in all cases. What I'm showing you here is just some of the potential results of chronic inflammation. The ones that we most often associate with it are rheumatoid arthritis and cardiovascular disease seem to be two big ones. Cancer can result in the case of chronic inflammation or chronic damage of the liver, for example, cirrhosis leading to liver cancer. And also we can find additional autoimmune diseases as a result of chronic inflammation as well. So to review, what we've talked about in this video are the events that take place during acute inflammation. We talked about how resident macrophages and dendritic cells recruit neutrophils. Those neutrophils recruit additional cells, and the goal of these cells then are going to be to clear out that infection and cause a repair of the tissue as best as possible. In our next video, what we're going to talk about is how does phagocytosis occur? This is an incredibly important step or process that occurs during inflammation within phagocytes, and we really need to uncover how does phagocytosis kill microorganisms.